Sergeant Marcus Kane could still feel the phantom pain where Zara Vexthani's ceremonial blade had slipped between his ribs with the kind of surgical precision that marked elite Catharian shock troopers. The scar had healed into a jagged reminder that he'd come within millimeters of bleeding out on Havoc Ridge, saved only by emergency medical intervention and what the field medics had called impossibly lucky placement that missed vital organs by distances measured in fractions of centimeters. 3 months after the ceasefire that ended active hostilities between human colonial forces and the Catharian Empire, Marcus maintained patrol duties along the neutral zone that separated human settlements from Catharian military installations. The work was routine surveillance designed to monitor compliance with ceasefire agreements while avoiding provocative actions that could reignite the territorial conflict that had claimed hundreds of lives before diplomatic negotiations created the current uneasy peace. Marcus preferred the quiet patrols to active combat. His brush with death had left him more cautious about engaging in violence that could be avoided through careful reconnaissance and strategic positioning. But the isolation of border monitoring also provided time to think about details that combat operations had forced him to suppress, including memories of the warrior who had nearly ended his life with blade work that demonstrated both lethal competence and something that might have been regret when she realized her strike hadn't achieved immediate fatality. The first meal appeared outside his quarters on a Tuesday evening, precisely positioned beside his door in a way that avoided security sensors while remaining impossible to miss when he returned from patrol duties. The container held food that combined human nutritional requirements with Catharian culinary techniques, proteins prepared according to human dietary standards but seasoned with spices that created flavors he'd never encountered during standard military rations or civilian cuisine. Marcus's initial assumption was that the meal represented either a mistake in delivery or some kind of diplomatic gesture from the Catharian liaison office that maintained communication channels with human command staff. But the absence of any accompanying message or delivery notification suggested something more complex than routine diplomatic protocol, especially given the obvious care that had been invested in preparing food specifically calibrated for human physiology while incorporating Catharian cooking methods that suggested cultural knowledge rarely possessed by standard military personnel. The second meal appeared Wednesday evening, again precisely positioned and again containing food that demonstrated detailed understanding of human nutritional needs combined with Catharian preparation techniques. This time, Marcus noticed that the meal included minor variations in seasoning and presentation that suggested accommodation for personal preferences that could only have been determined through careful observation of his eating habits during mess hall meals or field rations consumption. By Thursday, Marcus was certain that the meal deliveries were intentional rather than accidental, though the complete absence of communication or explanation made it impossible to determine whether they represented friendly overture, intelligence-gathering operation, or something else entirely that his military training hadn't prepared him to recognize. His attempts to monitor his quarters during evening hours proved futile. Whoever was delivering the meals possessed infiltration skills that allowed them to approach his quarters, leave prepared food, and depart without triggering any of the security systems that should have detected unauthorized personnel in the residential areas of the human base. "Sergeant Kane," said Lieutenant Rodriguez during their weekly briefing on border patrol activities, "have you noticed any unusual Catharian activity in your sector? Intelligence reports suggest increased reconnaissance operations along the neutral zone perimeter." "Nothing that violates ceasefire protocols," Marcus replied, though he found himself wondering whether mysterious meal deliveries qualified as reconnaissance operations or represented something outside standard intelligence categories. Patrol encounters have been limited to standard monitoring positions maintained by both sides according to negotiated agreements. "Any direct contact with Catharian personnel?" Marcus hesitated, recognizing that the meal deliveries might constitute indirect contact that should be reported through proper channels, but uncertain about whether food left outside his quarters qualified as meaningful interaction or simply unusual behavior that didn't rise to the level of intelligence significance. "No direct contact," he said finally, deciding that technical accuracy was more important than detailed explanation of circumstances that he didn't understand well enough to report with confidence. The meals continued arriving every evening with clockwork precision, each one demonstrating increased understanding of his preferences and dietary requirements while incorporating Catharian cooking techniques that created flavors and textures he'd never experienced. Marcus began to appreciate not just the nutritional value of the food but the obvious skill and care that went into preparation. Whoever was providing these meals possessed culinary expertise that went far beyond standard military food service and suggested someone who understood cooking as artistic expression rather than mere sustenance provision. More intriguingly, the meals began including subtle variations in presentation and ingredient selection that followed patterns suggesting deliberate communication rather than random culinary choices. Certain combinations of spices appeared on days when his patrols had been particularly stressful, while other preparations seemed designed to provide energy and nutritional support for extended physical activity that corresponded with his duty schedule in ways that suggested detailed knowledge of his work routine and physical demands. "Marcus," said Corporal Hayes during their shared evening meal in the base mess hall, "you've been eating less during regular meals lately. Everything okay with your appetite?" "Just supplementing with additional nutrition," Marcus replied, which was technically accurate while avoiding explanation of circumstances that might require him to report ongoing contact with unknown personnel who possessed detailed knowledge of his schedule and quarters location. "Supplementing how?" "The commissary doesn't carry anything that would improve the standard rations we're getting." Marcus found himself reluctant to discuss the meal deliveries with colleagues who might interpret the situation as security breach requiring immediate investigation that could disrupt whatever was developing between him and his unknown benefactor. Something about the care and consistency of the food deliveries suggested that ending them abruptly might eliminate an opportunity for understanding that could prove valuable for more than just personal reasons. "Private nutrition research," he said, offering deflection that discouraged further inquiry while maintaining plausible cover for his changed eating patterns. As the second week of meal deliveries continued, Marcus began leaving small tokens of appreciation near his quarters, items that acknowledged the care he was receiving without directly confronting what might be a sensitive cultural situation or intelligence operation that could be compromised by premature disclosure. A small flower from the base garden disappeared along with the empty food container. A hand-carved wooden utensil vanished overnight. Each token was accepted, confirming that his mysterious benefactor was aware of his attempts at reciprocal communication and apparently appreciated his recognition of their efforts. The situation became more complex when Marcus sustained minor injuries during a patrol accident. Nothing serious, just scrapes and bruises from a fall that any active soldier might experience during routine operations. The meal that appeared that evening included medicinal herbs and prepared foods specifically designed to support healing from exactly the type of minor trauma he'd sustained, demonstrating knowledge that could only come from either detailed surveillance of his activities or genuine concern for his welfare that motivated careful attention to his condition and immediate needs. Marcus touched the scar where Zara Vexthani's blade had nearly ended his life, remembering the look in her eyes during the moment when her strike had failed to achieve the fatal result that her training had intended. There had been something in her expression that suggested professional disappointment mixed with what might have been relief, though the chaos of battle had prevented him from analyzing her reaction with the kind of detailed attention that current circumstances were encouraging. As he prepared for sleep, Marcus found himself wondering whether his mysterious food provider might be connected to his memories of Havoc Ridge, and whether the meals represented something more personal than random acts of cultural diplomacy or intelligence gathering. The thought that Zara Vexthani might be the person providing nightly care through food deliveries seemed both impossible and somehow inevitable, though confirming such a theory would require direct confrontation that could end whatever unusual relationship was developing between them. For now, Marcus decided to continue accepting the meals while remaining alert for additional clues about the identity and motivations of someone who had transformed his evening routine from solitary reflection into anticipation of sustenance that came with implicit messages of concern, care, and perhaps something approaching atonement for violence that had left permanent marks on both their lives. 2 weeks into what Marcus had begun thinking of as his evening mysteries, he started recognizing patterns in the meal deliveries that suggested his unknown benefactor possessed not just detailed knowledge of his schedule and preferences, but access to information that should have been restricted to military medical personnel and intelligence files. The foods were calibrated with precision that indicated understanding of his metabolic needs, injury recovery requirements, and even stress indicators that standard observation couldn't have provided. The mineral content in tonight's meal is specifically designed for someone recovering from tissue trauma, Marcus observed to himself while analyzing a particularly complex soup that included ingredients he couldn't identify but that seemed to address nutritional deficiencies he hadn't realized he was experiencing. This isn't just good cooking, this is medical intervention disguised as cuisine. His attempts to catch his mysterious provider in the act had evolved from casual surveillance to systematic counter-reconnaissance operations that utilized every stealth technique his military training had provided. But whoever was delivering the meals possessed infiltration skills that exceeded his ability to detect or intercept, moving through the base's security systems with the kind of fluid competence that suggested either inside knowledge of human defensive protocols or training in advanced stealth techniques that surpassed standard military capabilities. The breakthrough in his investigation came when Marcus noticed that the meal deliveries corresponded precisely with specific duty rotations in the neutral zone monitoring schedule. Cross-referencing his own patrol times with known Catharian reconnaissance activities revealed a pattern that made his pulse quicken with recognition and growing certainty about the identity of his evening visitor. Zara Vexthani, he whispered, studying intelligence reports that confirmed her presence as part of Catharian monitoring operations along the same border sections he patrolled. Elite shock trooper, specialized in infiltration and reconnaissance, assigned to neutral zone observation duties. The woman who had nearly killed him with surgical blade work was operating in the same geographical area where someone with remarkable stealth capabilities was providing him with nightly meals that demonstrated intimate knowledge of his medical history and nutritional requirements. The coincidence was too significant to ignore, though accepting it meant acknowledging that his former enemy was somehow taking responsibility for his ongoing welfare through food deliveries that showed obvious care and attention to his recovery needs. Marcus began modifying his evening routines to test his theory, varying his return times and patrol routes while monitoring whether the meal deliveries adjusted to accommodate changes in his schedule. The results confirmed his growing certainty. Whoever was providing the meals possessed real-time knowledge of his activities and adapted their delivery timing to ensure he would find fresh, properly prepared food regardless of variations in his duty schedule. She's watching me, Marcus realized, though the implications of sustained surveillance by someone with Zara's combat capabilities created more questions than answers about her motivations and intentions. Close enough to monitor my daily activities, skilled enough to infiltrate base security systems, and knowledgeable enough about human physiology to provide medical support through dietary intervention. The tokens of appreciation he'd been leaving began disappearing with the same precision that characterized the meal deliveries, confirming that his attempts at reciprocal communication were being received and acknowledged even though direct contact remained absent. Marcus started including small items that carried specific meaning, a piece of metal from shrapnel that had been removed from his side after the Havoc Ridge engagement, hand-carved figures that depicted Catharian cultural symbols he'd learned about during pre-deployment briefings, written notes expressing gratitude for care that went far beyond what enemies typically provided for each other. Each item vanished overnight, suggesting that Zara was not only receiving his attempts at communication but considering them significant enough to collect rather than simply disposing of them as security risks that could compromise her covert operations. The most revealing test came when Marcus deliberately sustained a minor injury during training exercises, nothing dangerous, just a small cut that any soldier might acquire during routine combat preparation. The meal that appeared that evening included medical herbs and prepared foods specifically calibrated to support healing from that exact type of wound, confirming that his injury had been observed and analyzed with enough precision to provide targeted medical intervention through dietary support. She's not just watching, Marcus said aloud, finally accepting the full implications of what he'd discovered. She's actively monitoring my welfare and providing medical care through food preparation that demonstrates concern for my recovery and ongoing health. The realization that Zara Vexthani, the elite Catharian warrior who had driven a ceremonial blade between his ribs with intent to kill, was now dedicating herself to ensuring his nutritional and medical needs were met created cognitive dissonance that challenged everything Marcus thought he understood about enemy relationships and post-combat behavior patterns. His military training suggested several possible explanations: intelligence gathering through establishment of personal connection, preparation for future operations that require detailed knowledge of his capabilities and vulnerabilities, or psychological warfare designed to create confusion and dependency that could be exploited during renewed hostilities. But the obvious care and genuine concern demonstrated through months of consistent food delivery suggested motivations that transcended tactical considerations and approached something closer to personal responsibility or cultural obligation. "Sergeant Kane," said Captain Morrison during their monthly review of patrol activities, "your performance evaluations have shown marked improvement in physical conditioning and stress management over the past month. Any changes in training routine or medical support that might account for enhanced operational effectiveness?" Marcus hesitated, recognizing that explaining his improved condition would require discussing the meal deliveries that he still didn't fully understand and couldn't report without potentially compromising whatever delicate relationship was developing between him and Zara. "Improved nutrition and stress management techniques," he replied, which was accurate while avoiding details that might trigger security investigations or diplomatic complications. "Improved nutrition from what source? The base commissary hasn't changed meal plans or quality standards recently." "Personal supplementation and dietary research," Marcus said, offering deflection that discouraged further inquiry while maintaining plausible explanation for changes that his colleagues were beginning to notice. "Just make sure any personal supplementation complies with military nutrition standards and doesn't interfere with unit readiness requirements." "Understood, sir." As Marcus prepared for another evening patrol, he found himself anticipating not just the meal that would be waiting when he returned, but the opportunity to leave another token of appreciation that might encourage Zara to consider more direct communication about whatever cultural or personal framework was motivating her continued care for someone she'd once tried to kill. The complexity of their unspoken relationship was becoming more intriguing than the mystery of her identity, though Marcus was beginning to understand that solving one mystery might be prerequisite for understanding the other. Whatever Catharian cultural concepts were driving Zara's behavior, they clearly operated according to principles that human military psychology hadn't prepared him to recognize or navigate. But something about her consistent care and obvious attention to his welfare suggested that their unusual relationship might be developing into something valuable for both of them, if he could find ways to communicate appreciation and curiosity without disrupting whatever delicate balance allowed her to continue providing support while maintaining the distance that she apparently considered necessary for their safety and the preservation of ceasefire agreements. The evening meal that awaited him after patrol would be another opportunity to test whether their unspoken communication could evolve into something approaching actual understanding, though Marcus was beginning to appreciate that some relationships developed more effectively through consistent action than through verbal explanation of motivations that might be too complex or culturally specific for direct translation between species who had been enemies until very recently. 6 weeks of nightly meal deliveries had established a routine that Marcus found himself planning his evenings around, though the complete absence of direct contact with Zara made their relationship feel like communicating with a benevolent ghost who understood his needs better than he understood them himself. The tokens he left were always accepted, the meals continued arriving with clockwork precision, and the obvious care invested in each preparation suggested someone who had made his welfare a personal priority that transcended their history of attempted mutual destruction. The breakthrough came during a border patrol that brought Marcus closer to Catharian monitoring positions than usual, when equipment failure in his communication system forced him to venture into neutral zone areas where both sides maintained observation posts according to ceasefire agreements. His first indication that he wasn't alone came when enhanced movement in the tree line suggested someone was tracking his progress with the kind of stealth capabilities that marked elite reconnaissance operatives. Marcus continued his patrol route while remaining alert for signs of hostile intent, though his growing certainty that Zara was monitoring his activities made him wonder whether the surveillance was protective rather than threatening. When a loose rock under his boot caused a minor fall that resulted in scrapes and a twisted ankle, the response from the tree line confirmed his suspicions about his shadow's identity and intentions. Zara emerged from concealment with the fluid grace that had made her so dangerous during their combat encounter, but her approach carried none of the predatory intent that had characterized her behavior during the Havoc Ridge engagement. Instead, she moved with obvious concern for his condition, her enhanced senses apparently assessing his injuries with the kind of medical attention that suggested genuine worry about his welfare. "You are injured," she said, her first words to him since their battle creating a voice connection to go with months of silent food deliveries. Her English carried the formal precision that marked Catharian education in human languages, though her tone suggested personal concern rather than professional assessment. Minor injuries, Marcus replied, testing his weight on the twisted ankle while studying her expression for signs of hostile intent or tactical evaluation. Nothing that requires medical intervention. Your ankle shows stress indicators that will compromise mobility if not properly treated, Zara observed, approaching close enough that Marcus could see the distinctive crimson markings that identified her warrior caste and the ceremonial blade that had nearly ended his life. Field treatment is advisable before attempting return journey to base. Marcus found himself accepting medical assistance from someone who possessed both the capability and previous intent to kill him, though her obvious expertise with battlefield injuries and genuine concern for his condition suggested that current circumstances had created different priorities than their previous encounter. As she worked to stabilize his ankle using techniques that combined Catharian medical knowledge with materials available in neutral zone environment, Marcus decided to address the question that had been growing more urgent with each passing evening. The meals, he said simply, watching her reaction to determine whether direct acknowledgement of her food deliveries would be welcome or create complications that could end their unusual relationship. Zara's hand stilled on the medical wrapping she was applying to his ankle, her expression shifting through configurations that suggested complex emotional processing. You are aware of their source. I've been aware for weeks. What I don't understand is why someone who tried to kill me is now ensuring I receive better nutrition and medical support than standard military protocols provide. Catharian warrior culture includes concepts that do not translate directly into human social frameworks, Zara replied, her attention returning to his ankle treatment though her voice carried the careful consideration that suggested she was choosing words for concepts that had no direct equivalent in standard language. Try me, Marcus said. I've had weeks to think about possible explanations, and none of them account for the level of care and consistency you've been providing. Zara was quiet for several minutes, completing his medical treatment while apparently considering whether their current situation justified explanation of cultural concepts she'd never shared with non-Catharians. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something that sounded like relief mixed with uncertainty about how her explanations would be received. When Catharian warriors inflict wounds that approach but do not achieve fatality, balance requires accepting responsibility for the opponent's continued welfare until spiritual equilibrium is restored between destruction and preservation, she said, testing his ankle stability with gentle pressure that confirmed the effectiveness of her treatment. You're saying you feel culturally obligated to take care of me because you didn't manage to kill me cleanly? I am saying that incomplete destruction creates debt that must be balanced through equivalent creation or preservation efforts, Zara corrected. Your continued existence became my responsibility when my blade failed to achieve intended result. Marcus processed this information while studying her expression, beginning to understand that the meal deliveries represented something closer to spiritual requirement than personal choice, though the obvious care she invested in food preparation suggested that cultural obligation had evolved into something more complex than mere duty fulfillment. And the meals are your way of fulfilling this cultural obligation? Nutrition, medical support, and welfare monitoring until balance is achieved and debt is resolved, she confirmed, though something in her tone suggested that the relationship had become more personally significant than simple cultural requirement. When is the debt considered resolved? When I recover completely from injuries you inflicted, or when you provided equivalent value to what you attempted to destroy? Traditional resolution occurs when the preserved life achieves contribution that balances the destruction that was attempted, Zara replied. But individual interpretation of balance requirements varies according to personal assessment of spiritual equilibrium. Marcus smiled despite the strange circumstances of receiving cultural education from someone who had tried to kill him. So you get to decide when you've done enough to balance the cosmic books for nearly ending my life? I get to decide when continued responsibility is no longer necessary for maintaining spiritual harmony, she said, though her expression suggested that reaching such determination might be more complex than she'd originally anticipated. What if I don't want the responsibility to end? Marcus asked, surprising himself with the directness of the question. What if I've come to value not just the meals but the knowledge that someone is paying attention to my welfare with the kind of consistency and care that goes beyond duty obligation? Zara's crimson markings shifted through patterns that Marcus couldn't interpret, though her obvious surprise at his question suggested that recipient preferences weren't typically considered in traditional cultural frameworks. Human perspective is not usually factored into Catharian spiritual balance calculations. Maybe it should be, Marcus said. Because from my perspective, having someone care about my welfare, even someone who once tried to kill me, has become one of the most positive aspects of my current assignment. You value care from someone who inflicted injury that continues to affect your physical capabilities? I value care from someone whose attention to my welfare demonstrates that people can change, that enemies can become something approaching friends, and that cultural concepts like spiritual balance might create opportunities for relationships that transcend whatever brought us into conflict originally. Zara studied his expression with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was processing concepts that challenged her understanding of how preservation debt was supposed to function according to traditional Catharian frameworks. Your perspective suggests that resolution of spiritual obligation might involve ongoing relationship rather than completion of specific duties. My perspective suggests that maybe the best way to balance attempted destruction is to create something positive that wouldn't have existed without the original conflict, Marcus replied. Like friendship between people who might never have had reason to understand each other if they hadn't started as enemies. As Zara helped him test his treated ankle and confirmed that he could complete his return journey to base without further injury, Marcus realized that their first direct conversation had created possibilities for relationship development that months of silent food delivery had prepared but couldn't accomplish without verbal communication about intentions and desires that transcended cultural obligations. Zara, he said as she prepared to fade back into the tree-lined surveillance position that would allow her to monitor his safe return while maintaining the distance that ceasefire protocols required, would you consider joining me for one of those meals sometime? Instead of just providing them anonymously. Her pause suggested that his invitation required consideration of factors beyond simple acceptance or refusal, though her expression indicated genuine interest in possibilities that direct interaction might create. Cultural protocols are complex when preservation debt involves ongoing contact rather than distant monitoring, she said finally. But complexity does not necessarily indicate impossibility. Then maybe we can work together to figure out how to navigate the complexity, Marcus suggested. Because I'd like to understand more about Catharian culture, and you might be interested in learning whether human friendship offers anything valuable enough to justify the risk of ongoing relationship with someone whose life you're responsible for preserving. As Zara disappeared into the neutral zone wilderness that provided cover for her monitoring activities, Marcus realized that his twisted ankle had created the opportunity for conversation that might transform their unusual relationship from mysterious caretaking into something approaching genuine partnership between former enemies who had discovered common ground in concepts of responsibility, care, and the possibility that some debts were better resolved through ongoing connection than through simple completion of obligation. The industrial accident that nearly collapsed the ceasefire occurred 3 weeks after Marcus's first direct conversation with Zara, when a chemical explosion at a processing facility on the neutral zone border threatened both human and Catharian civilian populations with toxic contamination that could prove fatal without immediate evacuation and medical intervention. Emergency protocols required cooperation between both sides' military forces to coordinate rescue operations that could save lives regardless of species or political affiliation. Marcus found himself assigned to evacuation logistics while Zara emerged from whatever covert assignment had kept her monitoring border activities, her presence at the Joint Command Post confirming her official status as a Catharian liaison officer whose cultural knowledge and tactical expertise made her invaluable for coordinating interspecies rescue efforts under time constraints that allowed no margin for diplomatic errors. Sergeant Kane, said Commander Torres as she reviewed personnel assignments for the emergency operation, you'll be working with Specialist Vexthani to coordinate civilian evacuation routes that accommodate both human and Catharian family structures and medical requirements. Understood, ma'am, Marcus replied, though he found himself curious about whether Zara had specifically requested partnership assignments or whether their collaboration was coincidental result of operational necessities that required her cultural expertise and his logistical experience. Working alongside Zara during crisis operations revealed aspects of her personality and capabilities that months of silent meal deliveries had never allowed him to observe. Her tactical brilliance was matched by genuine concern for civilian welfare that transcended species boundaries, while her knowledge of both human and Catharian psychology allowed her to manage evacuation procedures that saved lives through cultural sensitivity and strategic planning that either species alone couldn't have achieved. Human family units prioritize elderly and injured members during evacuation, while Catharian groups organize around warrior-class protection of breeding-age adults, Zara explained as they coordinated transport routes that needed to accommodate different cultural approaches to emergency survival. Combined evacuations require advanced communication about priority systems to prevent conflicts that could delay escape from contamination zones. Can we establish mixed groups that include both species, or do cultural differences require separate evacuation procedures? Marcus asked, reviewing transport capacity while calculating optimal passenger distributions. Mixed groups function effectively when leadership roles are clearly defined and cultural requirements are explicitly communicated rather than assumed, Zara replied. Your logistical expertise combined with my knowledge of Catharian evacuation psychology could create hybrid procedures that serve both populations more effectively than separate operations. As they worked together to save civilian lives that included families, children, and elderly individuals whose survival depended on their coordination and mutual understanding, Marcus found himself appreciating not just Zara's tactical capabilities but her obvious investment in protecting vulnerable populations whose welfare had become personally important to her rather than just professional responsibility. Zara, he said during a brief pause in evacuation coordination, can I ask you something about your cultural obligations and how they apply to situations like this? Ask, she replied, though her attention remained focused on transport schedules that would determine whether the final civilian groups reached safety before contamination levels became lethal. Your responsibility for my welfare, does it extend to situations where we're both working to protect other people, or is preservation debt specifically focused on individual relationship between the two of us? Preservation debt creates ongoing responsibility for welfare of preserved life, but such responsibility expands rather than contracts when preserved individual engages in activities that protect additional lives, she said, checking communication channels while answering his question with the kind of multitasking efficiency that characterized her approach to complex operations. So by working together to save civilians, we're both fulfilling cultural obligations that go beyond individual relationship maintenance. We are creating positive outcomes that justify preservation decisions and demonstrate value of ongoing cooperation between individuals whose relationship began through attempted destruction, Zara confirmed. Though such cooperation also creates additional complexity in determining when spiritual balance has been achieved. Marcus smiled despite the urgency of their current situation. Good complexity or problematic complexity? Complex complexity that requires individual assessment rather than traditional cultural frameworks, she replied, and Marcus caught something in her tone that suggested personal interest in exploring such complexity rather than resolving it through standard obligation completion procedures. The industrial accident that nearly collapsed the ceasefire occurred 3 weeks after Marcus's first direct conversation with Zara, when a chemical explosion at a processing facility on the neutral zone border threatened both human and Catharian civilian populations with toxic contamination that could prove fatal without immediate evacuation and medical intervention. Emergency protocols required cooperation between both sides' military forces to coordinate rescue operations that could save lives regardless of species or political affiliation. Marcus found himself assigned to evacuation logistics while Zara emerged from whatever covert assignment had kept her monitoring border activities, her presence at the Joint Command Post confirming her official status as a Catharian liaison officer whose cultural knowledge and tactical expertise made her invaluable for coordinating interspecies rescue efforts under time constraints that allowed no margin for diplomatic errors. Sergeant Kane, said Commander Torres as she reviewed personnel assignments for the emergency operation, you'll be working with Specialist Vexthani to coordinate civilian evacuation routes that accommodate both human and Catharian family structures and medical requirements. Understood, ma'am, Marcus replied, though he found himself curious about whether Zara had specifically requested partnership assignments or whether their collaboration was coincidental result of operational necessities that required her cultural expertise and his logistical experience. Working alongside Zara during crisis operations revealed aspects of her personality and capabilities that months of silent meal deliveries had never allowed him to observe. Her tactical brilliance was matched by genuine concern for civilian welfare that transcended species boundaries, while her knowledge of both human and Catharian psychology allowed her to manage evacuation procedures that saved lives through cultural sensitivity and strategic planning that either species alone couldn't have achieved. Human family units prioritize elderly and injured members during evacuation, while Catharian groups organize around warrior-class protection of breeding-age adults, Zara explained as they coordinated transport routes that needed to accommodate different cultural approaches to emergency survival. Combined evacuations require advanced communication about priority systems to prevent conflicts that could delay escape from contamination zones. Can we establish mixed groups that include both species, or do cultural differences require separate evacuation procedures? Marcus asked, reviewing transport capacity while calculating optimal passenger distributions. Mixed groups function effectively when leadership roles are clearly defined and cultural requirements are explicitly communicated rather than assumed, Zara replied. Your logistical expertise combined with my knowledge of Catharian evacuation psychology could create hybrid procedures that serve both populations more effectively than separate operations. As they worked together to save civilian lives that included families, children, and elderly individuals whose survival depended on their coordination and mutual understanding, Marcus found himself appreciating not just Zara's tactical capabilities but her obvious investment in protecting vulnerable populations whose welfare had become personally important to her rather than just professional responsibility. Zara, he said during a brief pause in evacuation coordination, can I ask you something about your cultural obligations and how they apply to situations like this? Ask, she replied, though her attention remained focused on transport schedules that would determine whether the final civilian groups reached safety before contamination levels became lethal. Your responsibility for my welfare, does it extend to situations where we're both working to protect other people, or is preservation debt specifically focused on individual relationship between the two of us? Preservation debt creates ongoing responsibility for welfare of preserved life, but such responsibility expands rather than contracts when preserved individual engages in activities that protect additional lives, she said, checking communication channels while answering his question with the kind of multitasking efficiency that characterized her approach to complex operations. So by working together to save civilians, we're both fulfilling cultural obligations that go beyond individual relationship maintenance. We are creating positive outcomes that justify preservation decisions and demonstrate value of ongoing cooperation between individuals whose relationship began through attempted destruction, Zara confirmed. Though such cooperation also creates additional complexity in determining when spiritual balance has been achieved. Marcus smiled despite the urgency of their current situation. Good complexity or problematic complexity? Complex complexity that requires individual assessment rather than traditional cultural frameworks, she replied, and Marcus caught something in her tone that suggested personal interest in exploring such complexity rather than resolving it through standard obligation completion procedures. The successful evacuation of all civilian populations was achieved through coordination that proved both species could work together effectively when circumstances required cooperation rather than competition for resources or territorial control. As they reviewed final casualty reports that showed 0 fatalities and minimal injuries despite the scale of the emergency, Marcus realized that their partnership had produced results that neither could have achieved independently. 0 civilian casualties, Commander Torres announced to the Joint Command Staff. Evacuation completed 37 minutes ahead of critical contamination timeline. Outstanding coordination between human and Catharian personnel. As the emergency operations concluded and personnel began returning to normal assignments, Marcus found himself walking with Zara toward the transport area where she would return to Catharian territory while he resumed standard patrol duties along borders that had been temporarily dissolved during the crisis. Zara, he said, recognizing that their separation might return them to the pattern of distant meal deliveries and silent communication that had characterized their relationship before the emergency created opportunities for direct cooperation. I want to ask you something about your preservation debt and how you see it developing. Ask, she replied, though her expression suggested she anticipated questions that touched on areas more personal than professional. The cultural obligation that started this, preserving spiritual balance for nearly killing me. Does it require you to continue monitoring my welfare indefinitely, or is there a point where you decide the debt has been satisfied and move on to other responsibilities? Zara was quiet for several minutes, apparently considering how to explain concepts that her own culture might not have clear answers for, especially when preservation debt involved interspecies relationships that traditional frameworks hadn't anticipated. Traditional resolution occurs when preserved life demonstrates value that justifies preservation decision, she said finally. But determination of such value involves subjective assessment that varies according to individual judgment rather than universal standards. Meaning you get to decide when I've proven my life was worth preserving? Meaning that evidence of value becomes less important than desire to continue providing care and maintaining connection, Zara corrected, her voice carrying something that sounded like admission of personal feelings that transcended cultural obligations. Marcus felt his heart rate increase as he processed the implications of her statement. Are you saying that your meal deliveries have stopped being about cultural debt and started being about personal choice to maintain our relationship? I am saying that preservation debt has evolved into preservation desire, she replied, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since their conversation began. Continuing to ensure your welfare has become personally important rather than just culturally required. And what does preservation desire mean in terms of how we interact going forward? It means that I would like to continue providing care and maintaining connection not because spiritual balance requires it, but because I value our relationship and want to explore possibilities that go beyond traditional debt resolution. Marcus stopped walking, turning to face her completely while processing the recognition that their unusual relationship had indeed evolved from cultural obligation into something approaching genuine partnership between former enemies who had discovered common ground in concepts of care, responsibility, and mutual appreciation. Zara, he said, I'd like that too. Not just the meals, though I've come to appreciate them more than any food I've ever received, but the connection. The knowledge that someone understands my welfare matters personally to them, not just as duty or obligation. Even knowing that such connection involves ongoing relationship with someone who once attempted to end your life. Especially knowing that, Marcus replied. Because it proves that people can change, that enemies can become friends, and that the best relationships sometimes develop from the most unlikely circumstances. Zara's crimson markings shifted through patterns that Marcus was beginning to recognize as contentment mixed with hopeful anticipation. Then perhaps preservation debt can evolve into preservation partnership, with ongoing cooperation based on mutual choice rather than cultural requirement. I'd like to explore that possibility, Marcus agreed. Starting with shared meals where we can have conversations instead of silent food delivery, and developing into whatever kind of relationship two people from different species can build when they decide that caring about each other is worth the complexity of navigating cultural differences. 6 months later, Marcus and Zara had established themselves as an unofficial liaison team that helped prevent border incidents through communication and cooperation that neither species' formal diplomatic channels could achieve. Their relationship had evolved from mysterious meal deliveries to shared duties that combined his strategic planning capabilities with her cultural knowledge and tactical expertise. The evening meals continued, but now they were prepared together in shared quarters that accommodated both human and Catharian needs, with conversations that explored cultural differences, personal histories, and possibilities for futures that neither had imagined when their relationship began with attempted mutual destruction on Havoc Ridge. Marcus, Zara said one evening as they prepared a meal that combined both their cultures' cooking traditions, do you ever regret that our relationship began with me trying to kill you? Never, Marcus replied, touching the scar that had become a symbol of transformation rather than trauma. Because without that battle, we never would have had reason to discover that some debts are better resolved through ongoing connection than simple obligation completion. And some preservation efforts create relationships that justify both the original conflict and the subsequent cooperation, Zara agreed, her markings brightening with patterns that conveyed deep contentment. Their unusual beginning had indeed led to something neither could have anticipated, partnership that transcended species boundaries and proved that the most meaningful relationships sometimes develop from the courage to transform attempted destruction into ongoing creation of something valuable enough to justify every risk that such transformation required.